So hello and welcome. My name is Robert Ganley. I'm a linguistic editor for the website Culture Eco, and today I'm joined by Professor Caroline S. Wagner from the Ohio State University in the faculty of the John Glenn College for Public Affairs. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today, Caroline.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you very much. So from what I've read, you've got a very strong background in communication research, particularly on how science and technology relates to policy making and science and innovation.
Yes.
Yes, and also how this leads to international collaboration within science, and this will be the main thing that we are discussing today.
Yes. I
So,
look forward to our discussion.
I should probably give a bit of background first to say why we're here and what we're talking about today. So previously there were a few articles published on the website which were particularly critical about scientific publishing. So in particular, the higher impact journals were singled out for criticism. And this was also by our first ever interview with Nobel Prize winner Randy Schekman, who's also been vocally critical about the higher impact journals. And this has led to a discussion about how science is communicated and what the best way to communicate science would be. And for this reason, we're very interested in hearing what Professor Wagner has to share with us today. So thanks again for taking the time to talk with us.
Yes, indeed. I think I tweeted a criticism of the
Yeah.
the comments being made. Yes, one little tweet, of course, can't possibly communicate the whole story. So I'm glad to have the chance to talk a little bit more about this. It's obviously a critically important issue, one that's being debated across the world, right, with Plan S and so many other aspects of publishing and communication. So.
Yeah, it's true. Well, it'll be really useful to hear your insights because I guess there's more than one way to communicate science, and I think the main point of many of the articles that were published were that perhaps certain journals are becoming too influential and having too much power, and this can obviously influence the way that scientists behave and the way that they choose to communicate or not communicate as part of this global network that you discuss at length in your book. So I think with that we can start with the first question, and so I can just read it out again. So in your book you describe how this global collaboration in openness within science has developed. Do you expect this to continue increasing, or do you think that everything is optimal now and you wouldn't expect to see any further increase in collaboration between different groups in different nations?
So I wrote a book on this whole topic
Mm-hmm.
called The Collaborative Era in Science, ERA, Era in Science, to actually discuss and describe the communication system of science. The reason I did it is because the system is, in fact, or evolving, let's say, quickly. So I wanted to be able to explain the system to policymakers who are trying to grasp the changes and to respond to them in a way that will help to optimize, new knowledge, right? So
Mm-hmm.
the idea is that in science and technology, in let's say scholarly research, the outcome that we're looking for is knowledge. We want new knowledge, and we need to validate and verify existing knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So, in order to do that, of course, people do research, but the research isn't the outcome. The communication of it is. So while there's been all kinds of great thoughts all throughout history and people have made different observations, it hasn't been until people communicate them in a way that can be shared that they've become science. Okay, so without being able to write it down and communicate it somehow, right?
Mm-hmm.
People in communications theory call it codification, right? We codify it. We put it into some kind of communicable information. So the system that has developed over centuries, let's say, to explain that information, to share it with other researchers, has generally been in the form of journal articles.
Mm-hmm.
So the article, let's say, right now is the core form of communication in science.
Exactly.
So the scientific article, of course, is also shared with people through conferences and other kinds of less formal communication, but the journal article is, let's say, the most formal kind of communication. So, and underneath that, let's say, think of it as like a little triangle with the journal article at the top. Underneath that is lots and lots and lots of informal communication that goes on. As you know, as a postdoc researcher, right? Within your laboratory, you're talking to one another, you're sharing information, you're trying out new ideas, and there's a bit of a competition, let's say, a cooperation that goes on and a competition that goes on as information formulates into something that is shareable with other researchers.
I suppose it's quite difficult to quantify that as well. So when it comes to the article, that's, like you say, just the tip of the iceberg, and beneath that there's a whole lot of communication and competition and everything that goes before it, which is pretty much unseen to the outside world. So it's quite difficult to quantify to what extent that's actually happening, would you say? Or
Yes, it is very hard to quantify that. And we know that a lot of that activity is education and training. So, when a government agency, let's say, funds a grant, they're well aware that while they hope that a scientific article of note will emerge from that, they also recognize fully that a lot of parts of it are to educate the next generation of researchers to fail, let's say, or have non-findings, as well as to pay for equipment and the research building and things like that. So the system itself is set up specifically to provide supports for all of those kinds of activities with the goal that a journal article will emerge that's of note enough that it is recognized as contributing new knowledge to the system. So the idea of the journal article then is that it's supposed to represent something new. And most fields of science, the idea of contributing something really new, of course, is the goal, but the way you would know that it's new, how do you know that that is really new? If I read an article in your field, I probably wouldn't understand it. And I would need years of training in order to truly understand it and to see what is new. So how do we tell then what's new and what's worth sharing? Okay. Now, let me just step back a little bit, because if we think about what I'd like us to think about the communications that go on in science and technology, I would like us to think about it as a system. Okay, so where other people have talked a lot about it as a market, I would suggest a market is only one very limited kind of concept of a system. In fact, the knowledge system in science tends to be much more like an ecosystem. So I would suggest let's think about it that way. So I'd like to use this model of an ecosystem to help us think about new knowledge in science. So there are basically three ways in which new knowledge is introduced in science. One is a discovery. Okay, so in science, there are cases where somebody discovers something that was not recognized before, not seen. So some of those are very exciting. There's new planets. There's new species discovered. There was just an article yesterday that I read about the finding of an anthropological finding of new bones in Siberia that might suggest a new branch of the human species. So it's all, these are very exciting. We love to read about them. And they are things that are basically there that can be discovered and then are therefore shared. The second kind of development in science is a breakthrough. And that's where we perhaps know that what we're looking for. We actually have hypothesized that some new information could be there, but we haven't seen it yet. And so we seek to have a breakthrough in a scientific field to find something that we're expecting to find. So that would be things like the Higgs boson, for example, or where we look for new kinds of combinations of chemicals that we think are there, but we haven't actually proven it. Okay, so that's a second kind.
Yeah, I guess that's the most motivating part of science as well, is having an idea that something is a certain way and then devising a series of experiments to test it, and then hopefully finding out that the way you believe it should be is actually the way it is, and then being able to demonstrate that to other scientists. At least that's personally what I find the most interesting thing about science in general.
Well, and when you think about it, that's the moment of joy, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you're in it, that moment of joy when you have really and truly shown something new. I feel it too in my own field, when I'm able to put some information together in a new way. Excuse me, let me grab some Diet Coke. And make a contribution. I mean, that's just, sheer joy. So the third way that we think about these developments in science, and I'd love to know your feedback on this, is through a recombination. Okay, so in other words, we had something going on in chemistry, for example, and we had something going on in biology, and eventually the two come together in a way that creates a new insight. And so it creates, a lot of times in these kinds of combinations, creates a new subfield. So years ago, chemists and biologists came together, and eventually what we saw emerge was biochemistry. Okay, so if we think about those three areas, discovery, breakthrough, and recombination, what we see is that in some of those cases, let's say discovery is often very evident, self-evident, and so therefore maybe we don't need to go to a whole lot of experts and say, oh, do you agree? Sometimes they do, of course. Do you agree this is a discovery? But sometimes they're self-evident. And so, but the vast majority of scientific outcomes are the recombinations that I talked about. So if we think about the recombinations of knowledge, and I'm getting to this whole question about open access, I really will get there. But we think about recombinations, okay? And in most of these fields, the recombinations of knowledge are so highly technical that most people won't understand them. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. Mostly because you have to learn a whole language of your field. You have to understand what's gone before and what people see as like established knowledge and so on. And so I, for example, wouldn't be able to read a physics journal or a neuroscience journal, like the kind of work that you do, and understand it. I have to rely on experts in order to do that.
Yeah, I think this comes back to the reliance on journals and the peer review process as well, because it's very difficult for, say, someone in a different field to assess the worth of a research paper in a completely different field. And so you would rely on experts within that field to say whether it's good research or whether it's impactful or whether it's important even. So the peer review process is probably one of the main things that the journal publishers can provide. Although at the same time, while the journals would organize this, it's the scientists themselves that form the peer review process. So I guess one debate would be, to what extent do the journals control the peer review process, or should control the peer review process?
Yeah, so this is absolutely one of the critical questions that we're dealing with right now. And I would suggest that these two things are not in opposition. Most journals are actually controlled and run by people in the field. Okay, so I have a journal, I edit a journal on science policy, and so that's my field. So when I see new things come in to my journal, I tend to know who to go to in my field, because I know, just had a journal article come in on development of new manufacturing centers, and whether manufacturing centers are really helping to diffuse information and knowledge to the community. So I know exactly who to send that to because I've been in the field many years. I know the people working on that area. So I send it to them and I ask them, hey, what do you think of this? Is this new? Is this adding to the field? And I know that I can trust them because of their reputation. So many, many, many times in this area, in all areas of science and technology, the coin of the realm tends to be reputation. Okay, so if you have a great reputation, like Nobel Prize winners, they are often asked their opinion about new ideas, and many times, they'll say, great new idea, or not new at all. We already knew that. And so the way in which that happens, of course, is formalized in peer review, as you just said, and journals, editorial boards, and so on. And so these journals then, if we look at the system of journals, again, let's go back to the systemic idea, we have a whole bunch of different kinds. So let's just say we have a whole bunch of species of journals. Okay, so some are very famous, and it's very, very hard to get into those journals. Other journals are less famous, and they're still doing an important job of testing knowledge and making sure it adds something to the literature, like my little journal, Science and Public Policy. But but basically only a handful of people will read my journal, as opposed to some journals that are so famous that thousands of people will read those journals. So there's kind of a competition that goes on then for attention. So you have the reputation of the researcher, number one, and then number two, you have this competition for attention. So and we know that the competition for attention is getting more and more intense all the time, right?
Yes, true.
Because we have so many outlets, so many venues, so many ways in which we're trying to get our ideas out and get attention to them, that we have really a lot of competition, and as we see junior or newer researchers coming into a field, oftentimes feel that competition very intensely, right? You must feel it yourself.
Yeah, I was just wondering as well if I could add to your idea of a network, a global network forming within research. And I think you said in one of your book chapters that this network would be in some way self-correcting, so that if you withhold or distort information, or you don't have anything to share with other nodes in the network, then you'll be excluded from it. Or so in this sense, the network would be self-correcting, and it would only include members which would add something of value and for mutual benefit. I was just wondering, over what time scale could this correction occur? So I think the idea was that no one would be able to just ride the system for their own gain. They would have to actually contribute something as well. But in terms of careers or certain nodes, perhaps there could be a short-term gain which would in which the member could actually benefit from, I don't know, some sort of unfair play.
Yes, absolutely. So there's always going to be a free rider, somebody who's trying to free ride on the system. So yes, so the answer is to your basic question is yes, there are ways to do that. But let's think about this in terms of a network of people. We all have the experience of being in a social network in high school, let's say, right? And we know that in high school you have kind of the cool kids and then everyone else. And so, again, we have this sense that we know what a reputation-based network is. But usually, if you want to, quote unquote, gain attention in your social network, you want to have something to offer. You want to be able to reciprocate. So what happens in these global networks is exactly the same thing. So a lot of times what you see at the global level is the most famous or the more well reputed, the people with the highest reputation in science tend to be those working at the international level. And there's a reason for that. It is because when you have an international reputation, other people want to work with you. So that people, for example, I've interviewed some Nobel Prize winners, and they say that every day they receive letters and resumes from the cream of the crop, from top research centers all around the world.
It must be a good position to be in.
Cooperate, right? So they have to, pick and choose carefully. So who they're going to work with, and how are you going to choose? And most of the time, you can't know everybody. So what are you going to do? You're going to see, did they publish in a top journal? Did they go to a great school? Did they work with someone that that is, a really top researcher, right? And so there's a whole reputation function that goes on within that. Now, every once in a while, someone will pop up with an incredibly great idea, okay? A young researcher who gets the attention of a more senior researcher just on the basis of their incredibly great idea. And that does happen, but it's super, super rare, okay? It is very unusual that you find that somebody comes up with this just incredibly brilliant insight or finding without having come up through that reputation system. Usually people have to come up through the reputation system to some extent in order to gain attention to their work. And all of the journals that we have, all of the professional societies, these have all been grown up over periods of time. It's like, as I said, an ecosystem. If we think of a coral reef that's grown up by little bits of coral growing one on top of the other, we can think about that in the exact same way with little bits of information in science growing up over time, and then feeding the system, feeding all the fish and the crustaceans and other things that are there, feeding it, and then as it feeds it, right, new species are able to emerge because of the foundation and the kind of core of support that's there for new things to emerge. And we want the new things to emerge in science. That's what science and engineering, new knowledge scholarship is about. So we want that to be there, but we have to trust that some people who are extremely knowledgeable are going to be able to help us identify that. Now, over the many years, that's grown up in a system of journals, and I know that there's a lot of complaint about the way the system's operating right now, but I actually think the system is adapting and evolving pretty well without trying to come in and smash it all up and say, hey, let's just destroy this coral reef and start over, when in fact that's exactly what's supporting the system. So a lot of people on Twitter want to just do away with journals altogether, and say let's just search,
Put it all on Google.
Put it all on Google. We'll get some AIs and we'll find the new in there. Well, I would suggest that would be to smash up the very coral reef that is feeding the system. So is it all optimal? No. Is any evolutionary system ever optimal? No. But the fact is that the way the system has evolved, of course, it led us to where we are now. And there are new opportunities in the system, right? Because of all of the information technology we have. So that's all great. But to think that we'll smash up what we had before and be able to have a very, the kind of concept that some people have of open system means to not have journals, right? But in fact, the journals are the filter, right, through which these ideas compete. And while you might be, critical of one journal as having so much power or as opposed to another, that's evolved over time. You can't necessarily just kind of break it up and expect that the system will continue to operate to kind of adjudicate among the competition for attention. So I think that the system's actually evolving pretty well as it is. I see that emerging where you see these new open access journals online. PLOS was one of the first, of course, and there's others. But I think that many species can compete on this landscape without having to villainize one whole line of journals and say, well, they're bad, and let's just do away with them. In
Yeah,
fact,
don't publish in them and sort of boycott their subscriptions or whatever. But I think that with your analogy, comparing it to an evolutionary system, do you not think that if there's enough criticisms or enough critiques or enough response to the way things have evolved to be, do you not think that would direct the way that research is published in future? So would that kind of diminish if people believe that certain journals are becoming increasingly powerful? Do you think that another system would evolve slowly over time, not kind of destroying everything which has taken so long to develop? But do you think it could slowly move in a different direction if enough people reacted to the current state of things?
yes, I agree with that statement wholeheartedly. The system is already changing in that direction. There's already, I think more than 50% of some, at least from what I've seen from Science Metrics. I don't know if you read their work, but Science Metrics is a company in Canada that tracks this, and they talk about the fact that open access now is responsible for publishing as much as 50% of new work. That's just great. And I think increasingly researchers do want to choose open access if they can. There's several issues with that I'd like to present to you and actually ask you what you think. Because as I mentioned, the system runs on a process of reputation. So what happens a lot of times is the more reputed scientists and engineers, researchers, doctors, they're the ones who are able to get money, right? And money is exactly how you get the freedom to do really interesting work. So the people who have a reputation already get money, and so they get the money. And if you go to open access journals, you have to pay to put your work in there. Usually, you have to pay APCs, article processing costs, APCs. So who's going to have the money to put their journal article into an open access journal? The more famous people are going to have a leg up on other people because they're able to get money. And then when the time comes to publish, they're going to have money to pay the APC, right? And some of these APCs are really expensive and can be in the thousands of dollars. So junior researchers oftentimes don't have that money. They don't have the grant money. They don't have personal pocket money to pay $3,000 to have their article put into an open access journal. So what the concern to me as a communications scientist is that what we'll see is as this push more and more and more to rapidly go into open access without allowing the system to adjust over time, is that what we'll see is that the more famous you are, the more chance you'll have to publish, and it will get even worse than it already is. So to some extent, it's pretty bad already, right? In that gaining a reputation is getting harder and harder. And so what happens then if we see, perhaps you've heard of the Matthew effect in science, the Matthew effect being from the Gospel of Matthew, that the rich get richer. And so what we see is a lot of times in a system like the communication system of science, the rich do get richer. So you have citations and you get more citations, right? If you go on Google Scholar and you're looking for something, what do you look for? You look for the things that have more citations, right? Because you don't really know. And so I tend to look, let's just sort this by citation and what's getting attention. Of course, I don't always know the attention is for a good reason. Like sometimes things get attention
Yes.
because they're not good, right? So that happens too. So I have to use judgment when I'm looking at that. But I do tend to look for what's already gained attention. So, so what you see is that, and this is another issue that comes up for gender, right? Because a lot of times the things that are getting attention in the past are written by men, and they tend to, the rich get richer, so the highly cited work gets more cited. And so what you see a lot of times is women scholars have to struggle even harder because their, the work in the past wasn't was men and not women. So, and so you see that women have fewer citations than men in general across the board. So, because it's an attention economy, and you're trying to get attention. So my main concern about moving to open access and to having the APC system is that we'll see like kind of a runaway Matthew effect, right? Where the rich will continue to get richer, and they'll have this case where only the ones who have the money to publish will be in those journals. So the way the journal system is set up now, I know there's a lot of complaint about the for-profit companies, but that's only one part of the ecosystem. So my journal, for example, is published by Oxford University Press. It's not a high-profit organization in any way, but we can offer to our authors that they don't have to pay. And so we provide them a service, and I volunteer my time as an editor. I don't get paid for that. And then the journal, Oxford University Press, provides a lot of value. So they do all the copy editing. They provide the venue to get the work out. They go to conferences. They go to meetings. They provide, they bring with them the journal and pass it around, make sure it gets disseminated. So there is a lot of value provided by publishing houses. And in addition to that value, then someone who comes to my journal doesn't have to worry that they have to find, $3,000 in order to get their work, published, even if they go through all the peer review. So PLOS, for example, is a peer-reviewed journal, and it's peer-reviewed. The editors are very high-quality editors, and the reviewers are high-quality reviewers. But I'm not going to go there if I don't have the money to publish there. So I think the concern that I have about this kind of open, everything should be open, and why is our journals not free and open, is that it's going to exacerbate the kind of reputation-based, financially rich or richer, people having access to that publication system.
So I guess at the end of the day, you don't want the cost of publishing the work that you've already invested lots of money and lots of time into. You don't want that to be limited by the fees required to publish in the journal. But is this just limited to open access journals? I know that certain journals also charge quite a lot for the article to be published as well. I mean, I'm not sure if it's the case for Oxford University Press, but I know that for Elsevier there's often quite high publishing costs as well. So it's not kind of in the sense that all open access journals have a cost associated with publishing and all print journals don't. It's so I don't think it's as dichotomous as that.
I agree. So, for example, even on my journal, if you want to have your article listed as open access and come online first, there is a fee for that. So even Oxford will charge a fee. It's not that expensive, but they will do that. And same thing with Elsevier journals, as far as I understand it, and the ones I've published in, it's the same thing. You can go and have your article reviewed and published in the traditional model without paying. But if you want it to be open access and put online first, you have to pay. So, so yes, there is still some of that, and I've personally paid out of pocket sometimes because I really, really, really want to get my ideas out there. But I think the question is one of equity, and how can we ensure that junior researchers and the people who are really working to make their reputation, have an equitable access to the system, that we're not just favoring people who already are, the haves in the system.
Yeah, so that's an important thing as well, because I think many people feel deterred slightly when you see people who are already well established in the field with all the resources and already have a reputation. Then it can be quite difficult to compete with someone who's already got that reputation already. I was just wondering what your thoughts on alternative ways of communicating research. So one of the so because obviously the peer review process takes a lot of time, and often for very impactful papers it can take years before the paper is submitted, corrected, resubmitted, and published. There are also the options to publish on preprint servers, such as arXiv. Do you think they have a future in publishing research? I think the main motivation for them was that if you've made a discovery and you really don't want to be delayed before publishing because someone else might be working on the same thing and you believe you've discovered it first, and you want to make sure that you get the credit for making this discovery, and you don't want to be slowed down by um, the process of publishing. Would you say that these would have a future in communication, or do you think it's flawed because of the lack of a peer review process?
So the the kind of new models, let's say archives, preprints, and other, let's say, repositories, like university repositories,
Hmm.
are a nice way in which I think the system is testing new models. So this is where I think that evolutionary pressure is a good thing. That the different fields, for example, are testing the idea of putting work online first and seeing how people react to it. Um, I think this is a good idea, personally. Compete, right? So this is the idea of getting your work out there, putting it in a preprint like archives, for example. So again, the pressure is to gain and retain a reputation.
Hmm.
So as a researcher who is trying to build a reputation, there's a lot of pressure to make sure your work is really good quality
Hmm.
before you put it on there, right?
Yeah.
Because if you make a mistake and people start commenting that there's something wrong,
Hmm.
that will really hurt your reputation. So I do
Yeah.
think that there's a lot of pressure to do a good job. Also, a lot of times there's a pressure to publish with someone more famous, right?
Hmm.
So a junior researcher publishes with a more famous senior researcher, because they know that that will get some attention,
Hmm.
and that's actually a good thing because the senior researcher has an even greater
Yes.
interest in maintaining
Hmm.
reputation. So they're going to make sure that the work that comes out is good and not going to be, vilified, let's say, by
Hmm.
others as like, oh, this is a piece of junk. So to me, I think that these are really signs of a vital um, uh, and robust system that we have these new outlets and let people put their work on there and have
Hmm.
it critiqued. So, there is, of course, a danger in that too, because there is also a growing community of science communications people who are more in the press, let's say, who are doing, some of them are doing fantastic work. So they're going to see these things coming up on archives and preprints, and grab them and say, hey, here's a new finding. Well,
Hmm.
what if your work starts to get attention and then you find out there was a mistake, there was an
Hmm.
error, you have to pull it back, you have to retract your work. Retraction tends to be a really, really big mark of shame,
Hmm.
say, on
Yes.
people's work. So, again, I do think these systems are a positive move in the right direction. I think that they do provide us with new communication outlets, and but they have to be used with care because, if I go and read something that's not in my field, how do I know whether that's good or not? I really can't tell. So, and you don't want people grabbing onto something and running away with it. Like we saw, let's say, with the vaccination research that came out, right? And people ran away with that, and look at the damage it's done. So, and that actually went through peer review, which is really an interesting case study. But we do have to be careful because there is trust in the system too, and trust is absolutely critical to this research and communication system. If we can't trust it, then so much of what we're trying to accomplish will be undermined.
Mm-hmm. So you believe that these preprint servers are, although they're not peer reviewed, do you think that the reputation of a scientist would be enough to control the content which is put online?
So we've seen cases very recently where the pressure to gain reputation has led to some very negative outcomes. So, for example, the work by Dr. He in China, in which he altered the genetic information in embryos before they were implanted in a womb, led to an ethical crisis in science. So that was a case where a researcher is so pressured, it seems to me, so pressured by the desire for reputation that they take terrible risks. And we've seen that in a lot of cases. That was just one of the most famous ones recently. And that person went outside of the traditional journal and community, like where you're getting a research grant. So he didn't have a research grant, right? He used some other money. And so he didn't use the research grant process. He didn't have any review board. He didn't use the IRB. He didn't. And then the work was posted on YouTube and not published, right? So, these filters that are there, while on one hand they're frustrating to people and difficult to maneuver and make things slower and slow down the process, they're very important parts of the communication system. And sometimes they do create perverse outcomes. We can see that where people are struggling so much for reputation that they plagiarize, that they falsify data, that they take incredible risks with research subjects. So there are negative outcomes in the system, no question, and we hope that the system has some self-correcting functions within it that will help to dissuade people from doing this. But the concern is that as people are pressured by the system itself, that there perhaps be an increase in these kinds of malpractices in
so
research.
You think that the increased pressure that could be on younger researchers to publish or do some fantastic work, that kind of leads to higher risk taking, and therefore then there's more of a risk of quite negative or bad science being done, and therefore the peer review processes or some sort of reviewing processes more necessary than ever to limit the effect of this. Or is that accurate to say?
I agree 100% with what you just said. Yeah, I do. And that's why I would encourage anyone to please agree to review, right? It's hard because it takes a lot of time and you end up reviewing a lot of bad things. But it's so critical to our system and that people be willing to take that job on and do the reviewing.
I think I'll move on to the final question that we have now, which is, are the costs required by many journals justified, and if so, why? So I think, as we discussed before, there's often a very huge range of prices that different publishing groups will ask for, and I was wondering whether you believe the costs, the higher costs, whether they could be justified in some way.
So there are several different parts of the costing
Hmm.
issue that I'd like to talk about. One is the one that is gaining so much attention, which is the for-profit companies that do charge quite a bit for the access to their journals. That's one part. The pressure on them recently to reduce costs or to reduce their profit margins, perhaps, or to make information more widely available. To me, that's actually a good and healthy part of the system. We should be pressuring these companies to not gain a huge profit off
Hmm.
of public and publicly funded research. So that's one aspect. I don't view those companies as bad actors.
Hmm.
They are simply, operating in a system where they have taken what's there and sold something for the price that they're able to get.
I guess
But
it's a bit like testing the system, really. It's like seeing how high you can raise the costs before there's some reaction from the community, and then once there's a reaction, then that provides an incentive to reduce the costs, and in this way, the system may be self-correcting. Would you say that's also accurate, or?
I do think there's some of
Hmm.
that. I really do. And I think also that Elsevier and Clarivate, for example, two of the biggest companies that are in this space,
Hmm.
also provide a great deal of service to the community because they provide things like Web of Science and Scopus, which are tremendously valuable to the system to have available as a way to access information. So whether or not they deserve big profits is outside of my area of
Hmm.
research, so I don't know. But most of the journals that are published by nonprofit
Hmm.
organizations, a lot of times by professional societies and by university presses, which make no money. So, we're tending to focus and villainize a couple of companies that actually are just operating according to market forces.
Hmm.
Yeah, should we ask them to do more perhaps, or lower costs perhaps? That's fine. And it's the I know that librarians are very much under the gun in terms of budgets.
Hmm.
And that as we see this proliferation of new journals, that the costs of subscribing to these journals rises and rises, and they have this terrible budget pressure. And even gigantic universities like mine, Ohio State University, can't manage in their university budget to pay for all of these subscriptions. So I do recognize that there's an economic side that needs attention. And I do think it's a good thing that we're arguing about, who's going to subscribe to what. That's good, and that's a good positive function of the system. Criticism on some companies is probably warranted,
Hmm.
but for the most part, most journals are just struggling to get words out,
Yeah.
for people to read. And the idea that some of these would have to switch to open access, a lot of the smaller ones would go out of business
Hmm.
because professional societies wouldn't be able to afford to make the switch as it is, or we'll find out that a large swath of junior researchers find it extremely hard to publish because of the cost. So I would say, this gets to this question of Plan S and, should we force openness?
Hmm.
I would say let's let the system adjust and adapt a little more slowly
Yeah.
because
I guess it doesn't all happen overnight. I mean, there's a response to things, and then obviously things aren't going to change immediately, but rather take a bit longer to adapt, and then so you should only make rash decisions or force people into open access publication once you've given the time for the system to respond.
and to retain some value of equity.
Hmm.
equitable access is critical. If we're not allowing and ensuring that junior researchers are able to get into the system and publish, then in fact the system itself as a whole will really suffer greatly from the lack of those people able to access the system, and we'll end up with people with high reputations who tend to be a little more conservative actually, because they're conserving their reputation rather than trying to make it. And so as a result, what you see is the more famous people, they've made their reputation, so they don't need to take a lot of risks. And so as a result, you don't necessarily see the very top research coming from the most famous. They've already there. So you tend to see the more risky, more edgy work coming from younger people. So if we're making it harder for them to publish in the system, then we're going to see the system slow down in terms of its ability to provide us with new information.
Okay, so I guess your idea about the publishing groups that are making large profits is that they're not representative of publishing in general, but they're kind of outliers, albeit outliers which have a much greater influence than many of the other journals. Is that right to say, or?
Well, they're highly visible,
Mm-hmm.
and it's easy to criticize them. So, and they are big players on the landscape. So, it is important to critique them and to ask them what value are you adding and how it should that be costed. But the idea that we should put them out of business altogether, that is a misinformed view. That is not understanding how this system operates. All of these pieces interact, and they all have a part to play in the system. So I would say the idea that we would, let's say, cut down all the trees in order to reform the forest is actually probably not the right way forward. Let's discuss this. Let's make sure we have equity as a top value. Let's make sure that we understand that new and fresh ideas, new and fresh voices are critically important, and that we do require these filters in the system without which we wouldn't be able to truly advance and understand what's new. So the filters are important. We can't undo them. We have to have peer review. We need editorial boards. We need, we need journals that help to put copy editing and copy edit material and help to spread the word to others. So all of these functions are part of a very robust and useful system that's produced a lot of good. So yes, are there some problems in it? Of course. And could we optimize some parts within? Like any system, you can't take out one whole part of it and expect the system not to, react, and a lot of times negatively react. So we can't just expect that we're going to squash one whole part. I'd say let's continue the dialogue. The Open Scholarship Initiative, if you followed them at all, continues to discuss this in a very interesting way. The OSI, DOAJ is, of course, continues the discussion, and Scholarly Kitchen. So there are many different venues where this is being actively discussed, and let's keep it going and remember what we're trying to accomplish.
So you don't feel that there's any chance that certain players in this network could become so influential and so powerful that they could distort the system to benefit just themselves? You don't think that this would be possible, or that the network would just self-correct, so it wouldn't be possible?
So this is a good question. I do think there are big players who are already somewhat distorting the system. That's part of it. The question of whether or not we allow the kind of forces bubbling up from the bottom to challenge the the big players. That's the part that concerns me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're going to have big players. You're going to have famous people, famous institutions, famous journals. That's a result of the system evolving over time. The way in which that's kind of corrected is allowing, right, these kind of chaotic forces to impinge on that, criticize it, poke it, and make sure that it's being called to account. The part about the allowing these voices to emerge is the part that really needs to be protected, and encouraged. Without that, we will see these big players actually becoming more powerful, even though that's the opposite of what people want. People are wanting to encourage this dynamism. But if we aren't careful about things like the cost and things like the value of reputation, and we're not able to really and truly encourage new voices to come into the system, then in fact we're undermining the very thing that we are trying to accomplish.
Well, I think that comes to the end of the questions that we have for you today. So once again, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time today to talk to us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was just really fun talking with you, and I wish you the very, very best in your own research
Thank you
also
very much.
going forward. So thank you very much, Robert.
Thanks again.